The general ground on which the movement of these shapes produced from the notion takes place is the consciousness expressed in the first imaginative language, that of the epic, where the content devoid of a self is left disunited. It is the commonality as such whose wisdom finds utterance in the chorus of the elders. In the powerlessness of this chorus, the commonality has its representative because the common people themselves constitute merely the positive and passive material of the individuality of the government confronting it. Lacking the power of the negative, it is unable to hold together and to subdue the riches and varied abundance of the divine life, but lets it all go its own separate ways, and in its reverential hymns, it extols each individual moment as an independent God, first one and then another. But where it does detect the earnestness of the notion in its onward march, dashing these figures to pieces, and comes to see how ill it fares with its venerated gods who dare to trespass on ground where the notion holds sway, then it is not itself the negative power which actively interferes. On the contrary, it clings to the selfless thought of such power, clings to the consciousness of an alien fate, and produces the empty desire for ease and comfort, and feeble talk of appeasement. In its fear of the higher powers, which are the immediate instruments of the substance, fearful of their struggles amongst themselves, and fearful of the simple self of necessity, which crushes them as well as the living beings linked with them, in its compassion for these living beings, which it also knows to be the same as itself, it is conscious only of a paralyzing terror of this movement of equally helpless pity, and as the end of it all, the empty repose of submission to necessity, whose work is understood neither as the necessary deed of the character, nor as the action of the absolute being within itself. Here in paragraph 734, Hegel is now explicitly bringing in a key element or component of Greek tragedy, one that often has puzzled people, as Nietzsche points out in his, as he says, all too Hegelian work, The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music, the chorus. What is the chorus doing? And this is something, let me point out, as I teach Greek tragedies in my own classes to young students generally, they're often befuddled by the existence of the chorus. What are they doing? What's their function? Why couldn't they just have somebody else do the same thing as a single character when they're looking, say, at Sophocles' Antigone or at other Greek tragedies? And the answer is there's a function to the chorus. Hegel thinks that the function is not one that's explained in a single sentence. As a matter of fact, you notice he's talking about it in the next paragraph as well. It's going to be complex. And the chorus exists as, you could say, part of the ensemble, but it's also opposed to the characters. The chorus is, to some degree, characterless, although sometimes they're named as such, right? In the comedies of Aristophanes, there'll often be particular things like the frogs, right? And in, the tragedies, they're typically townspeople. As we're going to talk about in just a moment, the regular people, the ordinary people, the people who are not standing out as individuals. And so what we have here is the chorus as part of what's on stage. We have the characters that we've just talked about in the previous paragraph, which are going to be fleshed out a little bit more in their function and activities here. And we have, of course, the audience. In the previous paragraph, we saw that Hegel tells us that the audience is, as audience Zuhör, the ones who are listening, right? Audience comes from the audere, to hear, to listen to, but they're also spectators, Zuschauer, right? They're also looking at what is going on. So that's an important function of the play. You can't really have a tragedy as such in ancient times without there being an audience. And some people have thought of the chorus as basically like, you could say, a bunch of people providing the audience cues with how they're supposed to interpret that. And there's something that Hegel's saying towards the end, we're going to go into this quite a bit, having to do with emotions, that if you've read your Aristotle, or at least had some references to Aristotle, you've looked up Wikipedia entries about tragedy, and you see that, well, Aristotle thought that tragedy was about purifying catharsis, the audience of their emotions, their pathe, of fear and pity in particular. Hegel's talking about that here. He's not talking about that with respect to the audience, though. He's talking about that with respect to the chorus. And so maybe Hegel's doing something a bit different than what Aristotle is sketching out here. Maybe we should set that to the side, that set of assumptions coming from Aristotle about the audience and about the mediating function of the chorus, so that we can learn from Hegel. So what does Hegel actually say? The general ground, already here, interesting translation, right? The general ground on which the movement of these shapes, these Gestalten, produced from the notion takes place. So what are we talking about there? Two things. So general ground could be universal ground, allgemeiner Boden, right? The foundation, the floor, the basis, right? And we're going to see this Boden come up again later on in the paragraph, translated in a somewhat different way. There we go. Talking about trespassing on the ground where the notion holds sway, right? So in both cases we have the notion, the Begriff, the concept being brought up here. And we saw that in the previous paragraph. Actually, we saw a transition from a necessity which was begrifflos to a necessity which is the power of the negative and the Begriff in which things take place. There's an articulation that is happening, a gathering together and splitting apart and relating to each other on the part of the characters, you might say, the characters who matter. As it turns out, the chorus matters too, but not in the way that individualities matter. The people who actually put on the masks, not of chorus members, but of Creon or Antigone or of Oedipus or of Agamemnon or Clytemnestra, or pick whoever else you wish to talk about. So the general ground on which the movement of these shapes produced from the notion takes place, these shapes produced from the notion are the characters, is the consciousness expressed in the first imaginative language. And here, Miller reads in that of the epic, where the content devoid of a self is left disunited. Does that make sense to read it that way? I think so. And he's saying that there's something connecting the first imaginative language. Language is important here, right? And imagination, Vorstellung, is important here too. The play of fantasy, we might say, that of appearances. Why is it important that we don't have the kind of complex unification going on in the epic at this point? Because that's reflected in something similar, not exactly the same, but something similar that's happening in this general ground, the chorus, right? And who does the chorus represent? Understanding here that represent is kind of a loaded term, right? Because maybe we should say, who does the chorus depict? Who does the chorus emerge from? So he says, it's the commonality as such. What's the commonality? So, gemeine Volk, right? It is the folk, the people, the nation, the tribe, whatever you want to translate that as. Gemeine, the average, the common, the ordinary, the plain person, as opposed to the distinctive person who would be a god or a hero, or at least some character that is picked out as such, even if they're not particularly heroic. They're given a name, right? There's no name for the chorus except as a totality. The men of the village, right? Or whoever else is going to be the chorus. So the commonality, as such, whose wisdom, now that's interesting, whose wisdom finds expression, utterance, in the chorus of the elders. Okay, so it sounds like, well, that's cool. We've got the people who matter, the sort of elites, and then we've got the ordinary people. They have wisdom. They have somebody or a set of people representing them, the chorus of the elders, the ones who can actually speak for stuff. But notice what Hegel says immediately following this. He says, in the powerlessness of this chorus, the commonality has its representative, right? So this chorus, they get to say things. They don't have action. They don't even have what we might call reported action. Because remember, in Greek tragedy, they're not like, if somebody stabs somebody, it's usually not happening on stage. They go off stage and then somebody comes back and reports, they've killed themselves, or they stabbed somebody else. Like, again, great example of this. I keep returning to Sophocles because it's the play that I teach the most often. When Haemon tries to kill Creon, it's not being, it's not like an action movie where, Haemon pulls his sword and we have that universal sword in the scabbard sound that people use all the time. That's probably been turned into like a sound wave file. And then he goes after Creon and Creon pulls his sword out and parries, and that's not happening. It's the import, the essentiality of the action that's being depicted. And the chorus doesn't do anything, right? What does Hegel say? The common people themselves constitute merely the positive and passive material of the individuality of the government confronting it. Who's the government? It's going to be some of the characters. The tyrant, the war leader, in the case of like Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, before Agamemnon shows up, it's Clytemnestra. She's been in charge of Agamemnon's regime, and now he's returning, and she's like laying plots and saying, listen, Aegisthus, we'll kill this guy in the bathtub, and look he brought back that war captive. We're going to take care of her as well, So the government is the acting, and the chorus, they have to listen, they have to suffer. But they get to bitch and moan and admonish and bring stuff up. They do have an activity in language. Now notice what else he says here. We're going to come back to that point in just a moment. Lacking the power of the negative, it's unable to hold together and subdue the riches and varied abundance of the divine life. The divine life is that of the characters. Could be gods, could be heroes, could be demigods, could be, the few ordinary people who get to have names or at least titles, guard number one, people like that. That is being held together, or rather is emerging and connecting together as the concept, the notion that a particular tragedy is putting out there through the mediation of the actors and the thought that they are expressing and the actions they're engaging in, right, which has been arranged by no longer the minstrel, but the playwright, the tragedian. The concept is at work in that. The concept is holding things together. It is not doing that in this ground, Boden, of the chorus, which really could be called the general ground rather than the universal ground, because they think that they're saying universal things, but they're not. So lacking the power of the negative, right? It's unable to bring all these things together, but lets it all go its separate ways. And now notice what he says here. It's really interesting. Because Tragedy, epic forms of language, Sprache, right? They are superior forms of language discussed in this section of the, religion as a work of art, right? This spiritual work of art. What did we have prior to this in the abstract and the living work of art? We had other forms of language. One of them is the hymn. So what does the chorus do? Extols, praises, essentially, each individual moment as an independent God. Does that mean that they think that every one of the characters is a God? No, that's not the case, and that's not what Hegel's saying. They treat each of them as if they are a God, or we might say in some cases as a anti-God, an evil being that has to be admonished or turned away. But there are forms of language that are hymns, and the chorus is praising through hymns these different characters. Oh, Odysseus, not Odysseus. Oh, Oedipus, what a wonderful guy you are, so powerful. Only you can solve the riddle of what's going wrong with our land, right? Bad resolution to that one. And we could go on and on with examples. So he says, it extols each individual moment as an independent God, first one, then another. The chorus is unable to stick to a topic. The chorus is unable to see what is really happening, the interconnections, the unfolding of the concept. He goes on and he says, where it does detect the earnestness of the notion in its onward march, dashing these figures to pieces, and comes to see how ill it fares with its venerated gods, who dare not trespass on ground where the notion holds sway, there's that ground again, Boden, then it is not the negative power which actively interferes. The chorus can only look on. It can't act. It can see, we were full of crap when we were saying, oh, this is so wonderful, so great, so awesome. Now we see all these things coming together and some of the characters being crushed. Not everything can be resolved. And this produces affects that we're going to talk about in a moment. He goes on and he says, it's not the negative power which actively interferes. That is the necessity that we saw earlier. On the contrary, it clings to the selfless thought of such power. Here's how the chorus represents things to itself in the play, getting things partly right and also partly wrong. And there's also, interestingly, we could say a reference back to one of the things that came up in the reason section when we saw reasoning consciousness in its practical activity, trying to figure out what the, let's call it ethical project, the ethical substance is, pursuing pleasure and winding up instead in necessity, Notwendigkeit, right? Another word for this is Schicksal, fate. We've talked about this before. Hegel has not used this word Schicksal in describing Greek epic and tragedy up until this point, but now he's bringing it in. But fate can be understood as an intensification of the necessity that at first we thought was conceptless, begrifflos, now we realize is a complexly articulated concept in the tragedy, and which is going to crush some of the characters, crushing others in the process too. So, what is this consciousness on the part of the chorus? It clings to the consciousness, Bewusstsein, of an alien fate, Schicksal. Alien there is Fremde, right? So it could be hostile as well. Alien fate, consciousness of a fate that doesn't really make sense. This is more, again, like the Lehre, Notwendigkeit, the empty necessity that was taking place. And we're going to see emptiness is going to be mentioned here as well. So the consciousness of an alien fate, and it produces the empty desire, Leere, right? Empty desire for ease and comfort, Beruhigung, right? Resting, having what you need. The chorus is not able to see the true value, the true nobility, the true tragic nature of the actions and the sufferings and the conflicts and the justifications of the characters involved. So they tell them things like, hey, why don't you take it easy? Why are you getting so worked up about this? Let's all calm down. We don't want to tempt the gods and bring about all sorts of problems, do we? Right? They want things to be nice and easy, as if they ever were. I mean, this is a total side note, but it's funny to see the chorus in these tragedies about, conflicts that have been going on and on and on for years and years, being like, can't we all just get along? And you can say, when the hell did we ever all get along? When was this wonderful time that you're going back to when things were normal? Right? So consciousness of alien fate, empty desire. Now, we could talk about this in terms of kenos and kenosis, empty in the sense of being valueless, being grounded on nothing, And then we have feeble talk, Rede. Notice he doesn't say Sprache. It's not language, it's just chattering. Feeble talk of appeasement. Can't we all just get along? It would be so nice if we didn't have to be so dramatic about all this stuff. And the characters are like, no, we're dramatic characters. So this is the mistaken perspective of the chorus. But that plays an important role in the tragedy. The chorus is the ground, the Boden, right, that you need in order to have this drama playing itself out. If you say, we don't want any rum-dums, we don't want any ordinary people contaminating the wonderful field of our tragedy, and you push the chorus off the stage, get the hell out of here. You don't really have the drama in its original sense anymore. And maybe you're losing a vital connection with the in-person audience of Greek tragedy. Maybe you need the chorus there, right? Even though they're misunderstanding things, trying to reduce things to a tawdry level. And now here is where we get to the discussion of the affects. Miller's translation is a little bit periphrastic and pleonastic. That means that he's adding in some terms. Hegel doesn't say, fearful over and over again. He just says, in it, he talks about fear, Furcht, right? It's fear of the higher powers, which are the immediate instruments of the substance. Who's fear? The chorus. The chorus is afraid of them. Fearful, it just goes on in the German and says of their struggles. It doesn't say fearful of their struggles because we've already got fear. So fear of X, Y, and Z. So Y in this case is the struggles among the characters, and fearful as well of the simple self of necessity, which crushes them as well as the living beings linked with them. Okay, so we've got a lot of fear going on here, right? And we've got things that are fear-provoking. The chorus exists within the narrative, right? And the chorus isn't like the spectators who can be watching and be like, wow, that sucks what's happening with Agamemnon. I hope he doesn't get in that bathtub. Sort of like when people go to horror movies and they're sitting in the audience. And I mean, this really irritates the hell out of some people, but I think it's really funny myself. And, the person is, instead of going back to their car and driving away from the camp, they're like, there's a light on over there in that cabin, I should go investigate that. And then, they're getting to the door and somebody in the audience shouts out, don't go in there. Right? We can imagine something like that maybe happening with spectators. They're not directly in the drama. The chorus if things go wrong with the main characters, these are the ordinary people, things are going to be screwed up for them too. So they are fearful. They're worried about what's going to happen when these gods collide, these heroes fight against each other and make stupid decisions, right? So fear is part of it, Furcht. Notice what else he talks about later. Paralyzing terror, Schrecken. So we've got this entire modality of fear going on, an emotional, affective modality, very important, going from the, let's say, medium level to the highest level, terror, paralyzing terror that occurs. What else do we have going on? A different modality as well. He says, in its compassion for these living beings, which it also knows to be the same as itself. We can look at the characters and say, holy crap. Wow, I'm glad that my dad isn't also my brother. What a screwed up family that is, the sons and daughters of Oedipus, you know. We can feel Mitleiden is the German here, compassion. We also have this other term coming up, Bedauern, pity, right, that Miller is translating. And so we have two really important modalities of emotion. These are the ones that Aristotle brings up in Book 1 of the Poetics, right, where we're talking about tragedy. These are the things that Aristotle says the audience is being purified of. These are the things that the chorus is expressing and feeling. And perhaps that's how the catharsis takes place. We don't actually know that much about that. There's lots of theorizing, but at this point we're not getting that. So we've got equally helpless pity. And then at the end of it he says, the empty repose of submission to necessity. Now notice, that, again, still the perspective of the chorus, whose work is understood neither as the necessary deed of the character, the Tat. Once again, we have this Tat-Handel distinction going on. The necessary deed of the character. The characters are expressions, to some degree, of bits and pieces of necessity, right, of the concept. Nor is the action of the absolute being within itself, the Handel of the absolute being, the overall necessity. The chorus doesn't get this, but the chorus is just part of the picture. And so we're learning more about what Hegel takes to be essential to Greek tragedy by looking at all of this. The chorus has an important role, but a one-sided and mistaken conception of what's really taking place. And the audience is seeing all of this, at least if they are listening and watching and not just like, chomping on foodstuffs and drunk or something like that, chatting with each other. If they're actually there to watch the drama, they get to see this entire thing play out. And it's one more time, I do want to emphasize, the chorus for Hegel is this general ground that you need, sort of like a background for having the things in the foreground that we want to focus upon.